The marriage certificate still survives today in the Louisiana State Archives, yellowed, brittle, and fragile. It bears the names of Jeremiah Aldrich and Celeste, whose own name appears beneath his signature, listed coldly as property. What makes this document so deeply disturbing isn't just the grotesque nature of the union, a plantation owner marrying his enslaved cook, but the 13 mysterious deaths that followed in the months after their wedding in March of 1854. Local newspapers from that era, preserved in private collections, hint at a conspiracy so elaborate and cruel that authorities buried the entire investigation to protect some of Louisiana's most powerful families. The truth behind this forced marriage reveals a dark web of betrayal, revenge, and systematic torture. Horror so profound that even the violence-hardened South of the antebellum era was shaken to its core. Before we continue with the story of Jeremiah Aldrich and the hellish fate that awaited him at Willowbrook Plantation, make sure to subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, which state are you listening from? Now, let me take you back to a time when honor meant everything, and when broken trust could destroy a man in ways far worse than death. The events that led to that unholy marriage began 15 years earlier, in the murky backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, a place where fortunes were built on human flesh and blood money flowed as freely as the muddy river itself. Jeremiah Aldrich wasn't born into the plantation aristocracy that ruled Louisiana society in the 1840s. The son of a failed tobacco farmer from Kentucky, he arrived in New Orleans in 1839 with nothing but raw ambition burning in his chest and a willingness to engage in business that respectable men wouldn't touch, even with their finest gloves. The slave trade, though legal, carried a social stain among the old Creole families, who liked to pretend their fortunes came purely from sugar and cotton, not from the buying and selling of human lives. It was in the sweltering summer of 1840 that Aldrich met Marcus Devo and Samuel Rochelle, two men whose desperation matched his own ruthless drive. Devo, the youngest son of a fading sugar baron, needed money to save his family's plantation from creditors. Rochelle, a former ship captain ruined by yellow fever and bad investments, held priceless knowledge of the illegal slave routes running from Cuba and the Caribbean. Together, they formed what they proudly named the Delta Trading Company, operating from a warehouse on the outskirts of New Orleans, a place where the law grew thin and questions were never asked. Their business became more profitable than any of them had ever dared imagine. While legitimate traders dealt in documented property, with clear titles and health certificates, Aldrich and his partners specialized in what they cynically called recovery services. They bought enslaved people who had escaped from failed plantations, purchased kidnapped free blacks from corrupt bounty hunters, and most lucratively, smuggled fresh captives from illegal ships still crossing the Atlantic. Despite the official ban on the international slave trade, the profits were enormous. Their costs, almost nothing. They cared nothing for health, for housing, for humanity. For 3 years, the partnership thrived in the shadows of New Orleans society. Their profits bought them respectability and property. Devo rescued his family's plantation, expanding it into one of the most productive sugar estates in St. Charles Parish. Rochelle bought a fleet of riverboats, reinventing himself as a respected shipping magnate. And Jeremiah Aldrich? He acquired Willowbrook Plantation, a modest but profitable cotton estate about 40 miles upriver from New Orleans, complete with grand colonial mansion that declared his arrival among Louisiana's planter elite. But success bred carelessness, and carelessness attracted attention. By the spring of 1843, word spread that federal marshals were investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking questions, checking shipping manifests, interviewing survivors who had escaped their bondage. The three men gathered in Aldrich's new study at Willowbrook, surrounded by leather-bound books he couldn't read and portraits of ancestors who weren't his own. The air was heavy with fear. They all knew their empire of human misery was on the verge of collapse. Devo, nervous as always, urged them to dissolve the partnership and destroy all records. Rochelle argued for patience, to move their assets offshore and wait out the storm. But Aldrich had already chosen a different path, one born of pure, calculated evil. He would murder them both, make it look like a quarrel over money, and walk away the sole survivor, free to erase their crimes and claim every cent for himself. The plan was as cold as it was brilliant. The murders took place on a humid June night in 1843, inside the warehouse that had served as their base for 3 long years. Aldrich lured his partners there under the pretense of discussing their exit strategy. The setting was perfect. The district deserted after sunset, and the building itself marked for demolition within a month. He arrived early, concealing a loaded pistol beneath his coat and a razor-sharp skinning knife in his boot. His plan was brutally simple. Shoot Devo first, then stage a knife fight with Rochelle, leaving both men dead and himself the apparent survivor of a tragic dispute. He even hired 3 dockhands to act as false witnesses, men who would swear they'd seen Devo and Rochelle arguing violently earlier that day over missing money. When his partners finally arrived, they found Aldrich seated at their usual table, a bottle of whiskey and 3 glasses waiting, surrounded by ledgers and shipping papers. The meeting began just like any other. Devo poured himself a drink. They began the meeting reviewing the legal threats they now faced, with Rochelle outlining a careful plan to transfer their assets to banks in Havana, beyond the reach of American law. But as the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed, Aldrich skillfully steered the conversation toward their accumulated wealth, particularly the exact location of the cash reserves they'd hidden across New Orleans in banks and safe houses. It was Rochelle who first sensed that something was terribly wrong. The old sailor's instincts, sharpened by years of dangerous voyages and violent ports, picked up on the subtle changes in Aldrich's behavior, the way his eyes avoided theirs, how his hand kept drifting toward his coat pocket, the tension in his voice whenever he asked about account numbers and security arrangements. When Rochelle finally suggested they postpone the meeting and reconvene the next day, with their lawyers present, Aldrich knew his moment of opportunity was slipping away. The violence erupted without warning. Aldrich drew his pistol and fired straight into Devo's chest before the younger man could react. The gunshot echoed through the empty warehouse like thunder. Devo's body jerked backward, collapsing into his chair, blood spreading across his white shirt as his eyes froze wide. A look of shock and betrayal etched forever. But Rochelle, caught off guard yet still fueled by sheer survival, was far tougher than Aldrich expected. The former sea captain flipped a heavy table between them and lunged forward with a broken whiskey bottle, slashing across Aldrich's face and opening a deep cut on his left cheek, a wound that would scar him for life. What followed was a brutal, desperate struggle that lasted nearly 10 minutes, far longer than Aldrich had planned. Rochelle fought like a man who fully understood what was happening, refusing to die quietly. The 2 men crashed through crates, scattering ledgers and documents, smearing blood across every surface as they wrestled for control of the knife Aldrich had drawn from his boot. In the end, age betrayed Rochelle. At 53, he couldn't match the younger man's strength or endurance. Aldrich finally drove the blade deep into Rochelle's abdomen, twisting it upward toward his heart. The old sailor gasped, clawing at Aldrich's throat, but before life left his body, he managed to choke out words that would haunt Aldrich forever. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you. When he's old enough, he'll make you pay." At the time, Aldrich dismissed him as the delirious ravings of a dying man. What he didn't know was that Marcus Devo's younger brother, Philippe, had been secretly documenting their illegal operations, and that Samuel Rochelle's 17-year-old son, Henri, possessed detailed knowledge of every transaction, every contact, every crime the Delta Trading Company had committed over its 3 years of existence. Aldrich spent the next 4 hours methodically staging the scene to fit his fabricated story. He positioned Devo's body to suggest he'd been shot while reaching for a weapon. He placed Rochelle nearby, the bloody knife in his hand, and created wounds that implied a violent struggle between the 2 men. He scattered money across the floor to hint at a dispute over finances, damaged the office safe to make it look like a robbery gone wrong, and even inflicted fresh cuts on his own arms and hands to strengthen his tale of self-defense. The false witnesses did their part flawlessly. They swore to the police that they'd seen Devo and Rochelle arguing earlier that day about missing partnership funds. A bribed dock worker testified that he'd heard shouting, gunfire, and the sounds of violent fight. Aldrich's explanation tied everything neatly together. He claimed he had arrived only to mediate the dispute, walking into a blood-soaked confrontation that forced him to defend his life. The New Orleans police, overworked and eager to close the case, accepted his version with little scrutiny. The official report concluded that Devo and Rochelle had killed each other in a business dispute, with Aldrich barely escaping with his life. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as planned, erasing any trace of the Delta Trading Company's operations. With his partners gone and their assets now unclaimed, Aldrich moved fast. He presented himself as the surviving partner of a legitimate shipping firm, armed with forged documents proving that Devo and Rochelle had agreed to transfer their shares to him in the event of their deaths. Banks that had once been wary of the three mysterious traders now welcomed the respectable plantation owner with open arms. Over the following months, Aldrich quietly emptied every account, every safe deposit box, every stash of hidden cash belonging to his murder partners. By his own estimate, he walked away with nearly $40,000, the equivalent of more than $1 million today. More importantly, he had erased the only two men who could tie him to the Delta Trading Company's crimes, leaving him free to reinvent himself as a respected gentleman of Louisiana society. But Aldrich had made a grave miscalculation. In his obsession with money and immediate survival, he completely ignored the families of the men he'd murdered, especially the younger relatives who would one day learn the truth and dedicate their lives to revenge. Their vengeance would be patient, deliberate, and far crueler than death. Philippe Devo was 22 when his brother Marcus was killed. Unlike the impulsive Devo men who came before him, Philippe was cold, calculating, and dangerously intelligent. As Marcus's confidant and unofficial business manager, Philippe had maintained detailed records of every Delta Trading Company transaction, coded ledgers of illegal slave purchases, shipping manifests from forbidden Caribbean routes, and most damning of all, correspondence with corrupt officials who had enabled their trade. And, perhaps most importantly, Philippe had never trusted Jeremiah Aldrich. Something about the ambitious Kentuckian's eagerness to involve himself in the cruelest aspects of their trade had always felt excessive, even by their own dark standards, even by the standards of men who trafficked in human flesh. Months before the murders, Philippe Devo had already begun investigating Jeremiah Aldrich's background. What he found were troubling inconsistencies, gaps in Aldrich's history, suspicious financial irregularities, and hints of motives far darker and more complex than simple greed. When the news of Marcus's death reached Philippe at the family's struggling plantation, his reaction wasn't grief. It was cold, focused fury. The official story didn't make sense to anyone who truly knew the three partners. Marcus, though desperate for money, was cautious by nature and would never have confronted Samuel Rochelle in violence. Rochelle, despite his rough sailor's past, was a deliberate, pragmatic man, one who saw problems in negotiation, not knife fights. And most damning of all, Aldrich's version of events included details Philippe knew to be impossible, references to money and accounts that had already been moved weeks before the supposed argument. Within days of the funeral, Philippe began his own investigation into so-called warehouse murders. Using his brother's old contacts, he questioned dock workers, examined shipping manifests, and bribed police officers to access the official evidence. What he uncovered confirmed his worst fears. The crime scene had been carefully staged. The witnesses had been paid off, and key pieces of evidence were missing, deliberately destroyed or ignored. Most telling of all, Philippe discovered that Aldrich had begun transferring his murder partner's assets within hours of their deaths. That level of preparation could only mean one thing: the killings had been planned. Meanwhile, Henri Rochelle, Samuel's 24-year-old son, was pursuing his own investigation from a very different angle. Henri possessed his father's seafaring connections, but combined them with something even more dangerous: a formal education in law and business. He'd spent years working in New Orleans banks and shipping firms, cultivating relationships with clerks, managers, and accountants, people who could quietly share information beyond the reach of Philippe's more direct methods. Henry's investigation revealed the full extent of Aldrich's theft. By dissecting bank ledgers, property deeds, and shipping transfers, he mapped out exactly how Aldrich had systematically looted the partnership. The total: more than $60,000 in cash, property, and business investments, a fortune built on the suffering of hundreds of enslaved souls. But what made Henry truly dangerous wasn't his access to the truth. It was his understanding of how the system itself worked. While Philippe sought to expose Aldrich through evidence and justice, Henry realized there was a far more effective path: use Aldrich's own greed as a weapon. Instead of chasing a futile legal case through Louisiana's corrupt courts, Henry began crafting a strategy to dismantle Aldrich's financial empire piece by piece, to destroy him from within. The two men met for the first time in the autumn of 1844, more than a year after murders. Their meeting took place at a quiet restaurant in the French Quarter, where Philippe presented the evidence he'd gathered in hopes of joining forces. Neither man expected how perfectly their skills aligned, nor how completely their shared thirst for justice would consume the next decade of their lives. By the spring of 1845, Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had transformed their parallel investigations into a single, calculated conspiracy. Their mission was simple, but their plan was intricate: to destroy Jeremiah Aldrich through the very same tools he'd used to destroy their families: betrayal, deception, and violence disguised as business. Yet, unlike Aldrich's impulsive brutality, their revenge would be deliberate, patient, and devastating in its precision. The first stage of their plan focused on infiltration, gaining access to Aldrich's world. Using his family's remaining social connections, Philippe began frequenting the same gentlemen's clubs, political gatherings, and society events where Aldrich now mingled as a respectable planner. His goal wasn't confrontation. It was observation, to learn Aldrich's habits, weaknesses, and most importantly, his financial pressure points. Charming and eloquent, Philippe easily won people over. Within months, he became one of Aldrich's casual acquaintances, a man to drink with, to gossip with, but never to fear. Meanwhile, Henri used his influence in the banking world to trace Aldrich's financial web. He discovered that the plantation owner's apparent wealth was built on a dangerous foundation: leveraged loans, risky investments, and speculative ventures that generated quick profits but deeper long-term debt. And then came the most critical discovery of all: Aldrich had developed a severe gambling addiction. He was losing thousands in high-stakes poker games and horse races, covering his debts by borrowing against Willowbrook's future harvests. That addiction became their perfect opening. By 1848, Henri had secured employment with the First National Bank of New Orleans, the very institution that held the mortgage on Willowbrook Plantation. From this position, he subtly manipulated Aldrich's financial standing. Loan renewals came with slightly higher interest rates. Payment schedules were adjusted to create cash flow crises at the worst possible times. Bit by bit, Henri tightened the noose, pushing Aldrich toward financial desperation, the kind of pressure that made men reckless, malleable, and easy to ruin. At the same time, Philippe had begun cultivating ties with several of New Orleans' most notorious gambling operators, men who ran secret games where fortunes changed hands in a single night. Through quiet bribes and whispered promises, Philippe arranged for Aldrich to be invited to these increasingly exclusive gatherings, games where stakes grew higher each week, and the other players were secretly working together to ensure that Jeremiah Aldrich never won again. The brilliance of their plan lay in its patience and precision. Instead of confronting Aldrich outright or seeking quick revenge through violence, they were methodically dismantling the very foundation of his wealth and respectability. Each loan payment became a source of anxiety. Every gambling loss deepened his desperation. Every failed attempt to raise money through reckless investments pushed him closer to collapse, the kind of ruin that would leave him defenseless against whatever punishment they ultimately chose. By 1851, their efforts were bearing fruit. Aldrich's debts had soared to nearly $30,000, and the interest payment alone were devouring most of his plantation's annual profits. He had been forced to sell several parcels of land just to cover his gambling losses. Rumors began circulating among Louisiana's elite that Willowbrook Plantation, once a symbol of prestige, was in dire financial trouble. But the real damage was psychological. Under constant financial pressure, Aldrich grew irritable, paranoid, and erratic. He snapped at servants, distrusted his business partners, and grew obsessed with finding new sources of income. Yet Philippe and Henri were not content with seeing him ruined on paper. Their goal was far darker. They wanted Aldrich to experience the same humiliation and dread their murder-kin had faced. They wanted him to feel justice closing in, to realize that his fortune had been built on blood and deceit, and that no amount of cunning could save him now. The final stage of their plan would push Aldrich beyond mere financial ruin into something far more terrifying: total subjugation. They intended to trap him so completely that death would appear preferable to what they had in store. But before that, they needed him alive, long enough to understand, piece by piece, the elegant cruelty of their revenge. It was Henri who conceived the most devastating twist, using Aldrich's own enslaved people as instruments of his undoing. Every plantation owner lived with a buried terror of slave rebellion, a fear that gnawed at even the most powerful men. Henri understood that fear could be weaponized, not through open revolt, but through something quieter, crueler, and far more personal. They would destroy Aldrich socially, not by killing him, but by forcing him into a union that would shatter his reputation beyond repair. The plan was shocking: to arrange Aldrich's marriage to one of his own enslaved women, turning his name into a public disgrace, and making him legally powerless to escape the consequences. Their chosen instrument was Celeste. Her selection was no accident. For months, Philippe and Henri had studied everyone living on Willowbrook Plantation, searching for someone whose forced marriage to Aldrich would inflict the deepest possible humiliation, and who could also help him control his fate from within. Celeste was perfect, though not for the reasons most would expect. At 38, she was a tall, commanding woman, but her true power lay not in her presence. It was in her mind, her unbreakable will, and her simmering hatred for Jeremiah Aldrich. Unlike many who hid their anger behind obedience, Celeste made no effort to disguise her contempt. As the plantation's head cook, she performed her duties with cold precision, yet her eyes burned with quiet fury every time Aldrich entered the room. Her hatred had history. In 1847, Aldrich purchased her from a failing Mississippi plantation, separating her from her husband and 3 children, each sold to different owners across the South. He could easily have bought them all, but chose not to, claiming he had no use for extra mouths. When Celeste begged him to at least buy her youngest child, a 10-year-old daughter, Aldrich laughed. "I'm running a plantation," he told her, "not an orphanage for colored children." For 7 long years, Celeste endured the agony of serving the man who had destroyed her family. She prepared his lavish meals, polished his silverware, and poured his wine, while she herself survived on scraps from the kitchen. She listened as he boasted of his business triumphs, knowing those profits were soaked in blood. She scrubbed the stains from his clothes after his late-night business trips, and watched him burn letters in the fireplace when creditors began closing in. Over time, Celeste came to know everything about him. She learned his habits, his illnesses, his fears. She knew which foods he preferred, which medicines soothed the stomach, which rooms he avoided after dark. This made her not just dangerous, but indispensable. Philippe and Henri realized that with the right persuasion, Celeste could become their most powerful ally, but approaching her directly would be impossible, even suicidal. Any contact with an enslaved person on Aldrich's estate could lead to imprisonment or worse. So they used intermediaries, free people of color from New Orleans markets who had legitimate reasons to visit rural plantations. Through these messengers, they reached out carefully, offering Celeste small sums of money in exchange for information about her master's activities. What they received surpassed their expectations. Celeste didn't just share information. She was already waging her own quiet war against Aldrich, a campaign of psychological torment, subtle and relentless, waged from the very heart of his household. For years, Celeste had been waging a quiet, invisible war against Jeremiah Aldrich. She deliberately oversalted his meals to worsen his chronic stomach pain. She accidentally broke his favorite dishes and heirlooms. She whispered rumors among the other enslaved people, tales of Aldrich's mounting debts and plans to sell him off to cover what he owed. Every act of defiance was subtle, deniable, and perfectly calculated to gnaw at his sanity without exposing her. When Philippe and Henri finally revealed who they were and what they intended to do, Celeste didn't hesitate for a second. She listened in silence, then promised her allegiance with a calm, burning certainty. She would do whatever it took to destroy the man who had murdered their family and shattered her own life. Her only condition was freedom, safe passage to Canada after Aldrich's death, and a chance to search for her surviving children. Philippe and Henri agreed instantly. They knew they hadn't just found an accomplice. They'd found a partner, someone whose hatred and intelligence made it a final, indispensable piece of their revenge. Over the next several months, they refined every detail of the plan. Aldrich would be driven to complete financial collapse through carefully arranged gambling losses and manipulated bank loans. Once he was trapped, they would present him with an offer he couldn't refuse: marry Celeste in a legally binding ceremony, or be handed over to creditors who would tear him apart. The marriage would annihilate his reputation among Louisiana's elite and give Philippe and Henri indirect legal control over his estate, all while placing Celeste close enough to administer the ultimate punishment: a slow, deliberate poisoning that would make Aldrich's death as prolonged and agonizing as the murders he had committed years before. But timing was everything. They needed to strike when Aldrich was at his most desperate, isolated from allies and unable to beg for help from the corrupt officials who once protected him. That opportunity arrived in early 1854, when Henri discovered that Aldrich planned to attend a high-stakes gambling tournament in New Orleans, his last, pathetic attempt to win back enough money to save Willowbrook Plantation from foreclosure. It was the perfect trap. The den where Aldrich's fate would be sealed was hidden in a converted warehouse near the New Orleans waterfront, a dim, smoke-choked room where the city's most dangerous and desperate men staked their souls on the turn of the card. On a suffocating February night in 1854, Aldrich arrived carrying a worn leather satchel containing $8,000, nearly every liquid asset he possessed after selling off enslaved people, livestock, and personal heirlooms. It was his final gamble, his last fragile hope of salvation. What he didn't know was that Philippe Deveau and Henri Rochelle had orchestrated every detail of this night for months. Every player at that table was part of their design, a cog in the intricate machinery of Aldrich's ruin. The game was 5-card stud. The opening stakes began at $500 a hand and escalated rapidly as the hours passed. At first, Aldrich's luck seemed to turn. He won a few small pots, enough to convince himself that fortune was finally smiling upon him. The brandy flowed, his confidence swelled, and with each glass he became more reckless. By midnight, half his money was gone, yet he couldn't stop. He played with the feverish desperation of a man who knew this was his last chance. The other players, following Philippe's careful instructions, let him win just enough to keep hope alive, then slowly tightened the noose, raising the stakes until every remaining dollar he had was resting on a single hand. It was past 2 a.m. when the final hand began. Outside, the fog had thickened to the point that even the glow of the gas lamps barely reached through the warehouse windows. Aldrich's pulse raced as he studied his cards, a pair of kings showing, with a promise of a full house if the next draw went his way. Convinced this was his redemption, he shoved his last $3,000 into pot. But the others had stronger hands and stronger motives. They had coordinated everything to ensure this would be the end. When the final card were revealed, Aldrich's kings fell to a full house held by a stranger with cold gray eyes. The man collected his winnings with mechanical precision, not triumph but certainty, the kind of certainty that only comes from knowing the outcome long before the game begins. Aldrich sat frozen, staring at a green felt where his last hope had died. Around him, the room emptied until only the stranger remained, studying him with detached curiosity, like a scientist observing something pitiful and broken. After several minutes of suffocating silence, The man spoke, his voice low, calm, touched by a faint French accent that made Aldrich's blood run cold. "Mr. Aldrich," he said evenly, "I believe it's time we discuss your outstanding obligations. The gentlemen who just left, they're not merely gamblers. They represent certain business interests that have been very patient with your difficulties. But patience, like luck, eventually runs out." Before Aldrich could respond, movement caught his eye. From the shadows near the warehouse door, another figure stepped into the gaslight. Philippe DeVoe. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same eyes, the same features Aldrich had last seen twisted in shock and pain more than a decade earlier, when Marcus DeVoe had died with a bullet in his chest and betrayal written across his face. Aldrich's breath caught in his throat. The color drained from his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost, Jeremiah," Philippe said softly, his voice edged with something colder than hatred. He said, moving closer to the table with a kind of predatory grace, "Perhaps because you have. My name is Philippe DeVoe, and I believe you knew my older brother Marcus quite well. In fact, you were the last person to see him alive, weren't you?" The warehouse suddenly felt impossibly cold, despite the heavy Louisiana humidity pressing outside. Aldrich's hands began to tremble as the full weight of his situation sank in. This had never been a random gambling night, nor a desperate chance to save his plantation. It had been a trap, a slow, deliberate snare, planned and executed with the kind of meticulous patience that only years of hatred could create. From another corner of the dim warehouse, Henri Rochelle emerged, completing the triangle of accusers surrounding Aldrich at the poker table. "My father, Samuel, always said you were clever, Mr. Aldrich. Clever enough to murder two men and steal their life's work, but not clever enough to realize that dead men sometimes leave behind sons who remember their father's stories and never forget their father's killers." The warehouse fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the distant moan of ship horns echoing across the fog-drenched river. Aldrich sat frozen between his accusers, his mind racing through possible escapes. And finding none, he was trapped, alone in an isolated building with two men who had spent over a decade preparing his downfall. And now, with his finances in complete ruin, no one would be looking for him if he simply vanished into the swamps of the Mississippi Delta. Philippe moved deliberately to the chair across from Aldrich and sat down with calm precision. "We know everything, Jeremiah," he said evenly. "We know about the Delta Trading Company and your illegal slave operations. We know about the warehouse where you murdered our fathers in cold blood. We know about the forged documents, the bribed witnesses, and how you stole everything they ever built." He leaned forward. "Most importantly, we know you've been living on blood money for 11 years, building your fine plantation life on the graves of the men you killed." Henri approached from the other side, producing a worn leather folder that he opened across the poker table like evidence in a courtroom. "These," he said coldly, "are copies of every financial transaction you made since 1843, Mr. Aldrich. Bank records showing how you drained our fathers' accounts. Property deeds proving how you took what rightfully belonged to their estates. And letters to the corrupt officials who helped you cover your tracks. Officials who, I might add, are now far more interested in saving their own necks than protecting yours." The evidence was staggering and real. Aldrich recognized documents he thought he had destroyed years ago, records that could only be recovered through immense effort, bribes, investigations, and quiet threats. And worst of all, there were sworn statements from witnesses, people who had seen fragments of his crimes, but had stayed silent until now. Philippe and Henri had built a case so complete it could have destroyed him in any court, and brought down half the Louisiana elite who had unknowingly helped him launder his stolen fortune. "The question now," Philippe continued, "is what we should do with this information. We could hand it to federal authorities, who would eagerly prosecute not only you, but every accomplice in your corrupt little empire. Or," he paused, letting the silence stretch, "we could simply whisper your true story into right ears in New Orleans, and watch what happens when the city learns that you've been living under false pretenses, built on the murder of their business partners." He gave a thin smile. Either way, I imagine your death would be unpleasant. Aldrich finally managed to speak, though his voice was barely a whisper. What do you want? Money? I can get money. My plantation is worth. Your plantation is worthless, Henri interrupted sharply. We hold the mortgage, remember? Along with most of your other debts. We've been buying up your obligation for years, Mr. Aldrich. Every loan, every gambling debt, every financial lifeline that's kept you afloat, it all belongs to us now. You have nothing left to bargain with except your life. He paused. And frankly, we're not particularly interested in preserving that either. The air in the warehouse grew colder still. Aldrich realized the full horror of his position. He was not just ruined, he was completely powerless. Everything he had built, every comfort he had known, every fragment of the respectable facade he had worn had been stripped away by the sons of the men he'd murdered. And yet, some desperate corner of his mind still refused to accept that death was inevitable. There is, however, one alternative, Philippe said, his tone suddenly thoughtful, almost mocking. One way you might continue breathing for a little while longer. It would demand a certain sacrifice of dignity, a public acknowledgement of your true nature, and proof of your complete submission to us. Henry's lips curled into a cold smile, the satisfaction of a man savoring the end of a long game. You're going to marry one of your slaves, Jeremiah, he said softly, publicly, legally, permanently. You'll stand before God in Louisiana society and take your cook, Celeste, as your lawful wife. You'll live with her, sleep in her bed, and present yourself to your peers as the man who chose to marry his own property. The words hit like a thunderclap. The idea was so grotesque, so far beyond the boundaries of antebellum decency, that Aldrich could hardly comprehend it. Marriage between a white plantation owner and an enslaved woman wasn't merely scandalous. It was social suicide, legal madness, and personal degradation on a level that made death seem merciful by comparison. You're insane, Aldrich whispered. No one would ever. It's impossible. No preacher would perform such a ceremony. No court would recognize. Actually, Philippe interrupted smoothly, we've already made the arrangements. There's a minister in Natchez Parish who's heavily in debt to certain gambling houses. He's agreed to perform a perfectly legal ceremony, witnessed, documented, and binding. And as for the courts, well, Louisiana law is quite clear. Once a marriage contract is properly executed, it's binding, regardless of how unusual the circumstances might be. You'd be legally married, Celeste, Philippe continued, with all the rights and obligations that come with that. Henri leaned across the table, his eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. The beauty of this arrangement, Mr. Aldrich, is that it gives you a choice. You can refuse our generous offer and face the consequences for your crimes. Consequences that will be far more painful than you can possibly imagine. Or you can accept temporary humiliation in exchange for continued life, however degraded that life may become. The warehouse fell silent once again as Aldrich battled with the impossible decision before him. Death would at least be final. And in death, a shred of reputation might survive. His neighbors would remember him as a gambler, a failed businessman, perhaps even a fool, but not as a murderer, not as the monster he truly was. Marriage to Celeste, on the other hand, would obliterate every part of his social identity. It would leave him alive, but condemned to years of ridicule, shame, and private torment. How long, he finally asked, his voice thin and trembling. If I agreed to this arrangement, how long would it last? Philippe and Henri exchanged a slow glance, one of shared triumph and cruel amusement. For the rest of your natural life, Mr. Aldrich, Philippe said smoothly, marriage is a sacred bond. After all, though, given your age and apparent health, we doubt your natural life will last quite as long as you might hope. The implication was unmistakable and chilling. This wasn't a reprieve. It was a slow execution disguised as matrimony, a living death that would break his spirit long before it claimed his body. Yet even that seemed preferable to the alternative. Immediate death in a fog-shrouded warehouse, his corpse dumped into the Mississippi River like garbage. Just when it seemed the nightmare had reached its peak, it somehow deepened. If this story is giving you chills, share it with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit the like button to support our work, and subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Now, let's uncover what happens next. After what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed, Aldrich finally raised his head and met the eyes of his tormentors. "If I agree to this marriage," he said hoarsely, "what guarantee do I have that you won't just kill me anyway?" "None whatsoever," Henri replied bluntly. "But you have our word that when death finally comes, it will be far kinder than what we had originally planned. Think of this marriage as an opportunity to demonstrate good behavior. Compliance will be rewarded with kindness. Resistance," he added with a thin smile, "will be punished creatively." Philippe drew a folded document from his coat and placed it beside the mountain of evidence that condemned Aldrich. "This is your marriage contract, properly prepared and awaiting only your signature. The ceremony is scheduled for tomorrow evening at Willowbrook Plantation. All your neighbors and business associates have been invited to witness your voluntary union with Celeste." He paused, savoring the look on Aldrich's face. "They've been told you've experienced a religious awakening, that you wish to demonstrate your Christian charity by elevating one of your slaves to the dignity of wife. The final humiliation was absolute, that he must pretend the marriage was his own idea, that he must play the part of a benevolent fool, a man moved by faith, rather than one coerced by vengeance. His neighbors might whisper that he'd gone mad, that his debts had broken his mind, but none would suspect the truth. No one would know of Marcus Devo or Samuel Rochelle. No one would know that their sons had returned to destroy him." Aldrich reached for the contract, his hand shaking so violently that the paper trembled like a leaf in a storm. The terms were simple and absolute. He would marry Celeste in a legal ceremony, live with her as husband and wife, and provide for her as any husband must. In exchange, his creditors would delay the collection of his debts and allow him to continue operating Willowbrook Plantation under their watchful eyes. As he scrawled his name across the contract that sealed his fate, Aldrich tried to convince himself that this was temporary, that once he had bought himself time, he could find a way out, appeal to the authorities, flee the state, discover some legal loophole that might void the marriage. But even as those desperate thoughts flickered through his mind, he saw the satisfaction in Philippe's and Henry's eyes. They had spent more than a decade building this moment. Every avenue of escape, every possible plea for help had already been closed. "Welcome to the family, brother-in-law," Philippe said softly, collecting the signed papers. "We'll see you tomorrow evening at the ceremony. I trust you'll dress appropriately for such a momentous occasion." The morning of March 15th, 1854, dawned gray and oppressive. Heavy clouds pressed low over the Louisiana swamps, and a humid wind carried the sour stench of rot from the water. Aldrich hadn't slept since his return from New Orleans. He'd spent the entire night pacing his study, staring at the marriage contract, the document that had ended everything he'd built in 15 years. Celeste had been informed of the arrangement by intermediaries, though she feigned surprise when Aldrich awkwardly tried to explain it to her over breakfast. She listened in silence to his stammering excuses, his talk of financial troubles and social obligations, with the patient calm of a parent indulging a lying child. When he finished, she merely nodded. "Yes, Master Aldrich," she said quietly. "I understand. I'll prepare myself for the ceremony." Her calm terrified him more than anger or tears ever could. It suggested she had known, perhaps for some time, and that she was not merely a participant, but a piece of a much larger design. As she moved gracefully around the kitchen, preparing what would be their last meal as master and slave, Aldrich began to grasp the truth. His tormentor's planning had been far more complete than he'd ever realized. Throughout the day, carriages rolled up the drive to Willowbrook Plantation. Neighbors, business partners, and curious acquaintances arrived in their finest clothes, answering invitations sent in Aldrich's name by Philippe and Henri. They came expecting a spectacle, a strange display of Christian benevolence, a plantation master elevating a servant to wife. Most assumed it was some elaborate joke, or perhaps the final evidence that Jeremiah Aldrich had lost his mind to debt and disgrace. What the guests found that day wasn't chaos or scandal, but rather a carefully organized wedding ceremony, complete with decorations, refreshments, and a nervous groom who seemed oddly sincere about the strange event. Aldrich had followed Philippe's advice, dressing in his finest clothes, and he played his part with a desperate conviction of a man who knew his life depended on it. When guests asked about his unusual choice, he repeated the story of his sudden religious awakening and Christian duty, saying it all with just enough sincerity to make it believable. Most simply dismissed it as another eccentric decision from a man clearly under stress. Celeste appeared dressed in a simple yet elegant gown that someone had provided. At 38, she was indeed a large woman, but she carried herself with such dignity and calm that even the most skeptical guests couldn't help but be impressed. More importantly, she seemed genuinely happy, smiling, thanking everyone for being there, and calling it the most important day of my life. The minister from Natchitoches Parish conducted the ceremony with professional precision. He read the traditional vows, waiting for each response in turn. When he reached the words, "Speak now or forever hold your peace," a few guests shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to object. After all, it appeared to be a legal, voluntary union between two consenting adults. Aldrich's voice barely carried beyond the front row as he whispered his vows, while Celeste's responses were clear and confident. She promised to love, honor, and obey her husband with such conviction that, for a brief moment, the ceremony almost felt normal, as if marriages between plantation owners and their former slaves were a common sight in Louisiana. Then came the most unsettling moment. The minister pronounced them husband and wife and instructed Aldrich to kiss his bride. The color drained from Aldrich's face. For a moment, it looked as if he might faint, but Celeste steadied him gently, rising on her toes to meet his lips with a brief, chaste kiss, one that sealed their union and began the final stage of his undoing. As the guests left, shaking their heads in disbelief, Aldrich stood alone in the plantation house that had once symbolized a success and respectability. But now the place felt different, alien and hostile, as if the ceremony had transformed it into something unrecognizable. Celeste moved through the rooms with quiet confidence, as though she instinctively knew the balance of power had shifted forever. She began rearranging furniture and personal items, asserting her new authority as mistress of the house. When Aldrich tried to object, she fixed him with a cold stare, filled with years of buried hatred, and said softly, "We're married now, Jeremiah. Husband and wife, partners. Don't you think it's time we started acting like it?" That first night, lie beside the woman who now shared his bed, Aldrich realized the depth of their torment. His enemies had devised something far more cruel than death. They had trapped him in a daily reminder of his own downfall, living with someone who knew exactly what he had done and exactly what he deserved. Every meal she prepared, every word she spoke, every gesture of affection, all of it served as a calculated reminder that his comfort had been built on blood and theft. But the true horror was still ahead. The marriage, as Aldrich would soon learn, wasn't the end of Philippe and Henry's revenge. It was only the beginning. The first month passed deceptively calmly. Celeste adapted to her new role with surprising ease. She managed the staff with firm authority, welcomed the few guests who still dared to visit Willowbrook Plantation, and kept up the social appearances that allowed Aldrich to cling to a shred of his old respectability. To outsiders, their marriage seemed as functional as any other, but Aldrich began noticing small, unsettling changes in his daily life. His morning coffee had a faintly bitter taste he couldn't quite place. His evening meals, beautifully cooked and elegantly served, left him nauseated and weak. He began suffering from headaches and dizzy spells that seemed worse whenever Celeste was near. At first, he blamed stress, the humiliation of his forced marriage, the strain of living under Philippe and Henry's watch. But as his condition worsened, he began to suspect something far more deliberate. His fears were confirmed one afternoon when Dr. Hamilton Warren, Willowbrook's longtime physician, visited after Aldrich collapsed during a business meeting. The doctor's examination revealed troubling signs, symptoms consistent with long-term poisoning. "Your condition is quite serious, Mr. Aldrich," Dr. Warren said grimly as he packed his instruments. "It suggests prolonged exposure to arsenic or another metallic poison. It builds slowly over months: weakness, digestive trouble, nerve damage. Without treatment and removal from the source, it's always fatal." The diagnosis confirmed Aldrich's worst nightmare. Celeste was killing him methodically, patiently, just as Philippe and Henri had destroyed his fortune and pride. Aldrich soon realized the full horror of his situation. Celeste wasn't trying to kill him quickly. She was administering poison in careful, measured doses, likely hidden as food or drink, crafting a death so slow it would look natural to anyone not specifically searching for signs of murder. But confronting her would be both dangerous and useless. Celeste was protected, by law as his wife, by her perfect image of innocence, and most of all, by her powerful connection to Philippe and Henri, the two men who controlled every part of Aldrich's fate. If he accused her, she could simply deny it, and Philippe and Henri would surely punish him for daring to question their chosen instrument of justice. So Aldrich turned inward, becoming secretive, cautious, paranoid. He began preparing his own meals in secret, using ingredients he selected himself and cooking them with utensils he kept hidden in his study. He refused to drink anything Celeste served, relying only on water from a private well that only he could reach. And at night, he locked himself in a guest room instead of sleeping beside his wife, terrified that she might finish the job while he slept. These precautions gave him a temporary sense of safety, but they also drew unwanted attention. Neighbors began whispering about his strange behavior, how thin and pale he looked, how nervous he seemed, and how he refused to eat or drink anything in his wife's presence. Rumors spread to the parish that Jeremiah Aldrich was losing his mind. Celeste played her part perfectly. When guests expressed concern, she responded with the gentle sadness of a devoted wife, worried for her ailing husband. She would prepare elaborate meals he refused to touch, offer him drinks he declined, and act heartbroken as though his rejection came from madness rather than fear. Her genius was in how she turned his survival instincts into evidence of insanity. His refusal to eat her food looked like irrational paranoia. His secretive behavior seemed like proof of mental breakdown. Even his attempts to confide in Dr. Warren and other trusted acquaintances were dismissed as delusions, the ravings of a man driven insane by humiliation and financial ruin. After all, who could believe that a formerly enslaved woman was capable of orchestrating such a slow, sophisticated murder? Who would think she had access to poisons or the knowledge to use them with such precision? By the spring of 1854, Aldrich was living in a waking nightmare. He knew the truth, that his wife was murdering him, yet every effort to save himself only convinced others he was losing his mind. He was trapped, dying slowly beside the very woman who had been chosen to destroy him. But Philippe and Henri's revenge wasn't limited to poison. They wanted more, not just physical suffering, but complete social annihilation. They wanted Aldrich to die alone, disgraced, and convinced that justice had finally caught up to him. The cruelest revelation came 3 months into their marriage. During a dinner party Celeste arranged to celebrate their anniversary. She invited several of their remaining neighbors, Dr. Warren, and other respected members of the community. Aldrich, always cautious, ate beforehand and planned to avoid anything his wife might offer. But that night, Celeste announced she had a special surprise, a bottle of wine, aged in the plantation cellar since before their marriage. A toast, she said, to their bright future together. The bottle was open in front of everyone, the glasses cleaned and poured in plain view, leaving Aldrich with no excuse to refuse. If he declined, he'd appear completely deranged. So, trembling, he raised the glass. Across the table, Celeste met his eyes. For the briefest moment, her mask slipped. He saw it, the cold, triumphant satisfaction of someone about to claim her long-awaited victory. And by then it was too late. The poison worked fast. Within minutes, Aldrich's stomach twisted in agony. His throat burned. His breath came in ragged gasps. He clutched his abdomen and collapsed, choking, as horrified guests looked on, believing they were witnessing the final breakdown of a madman. Dr. Warren rushed to help, but Celeste was already there, throwing herself over Aldrich's body, sobbing hysterically, begging the doctor to save him, and at the same time blocking every attempt to treat him. Her performance was flawless. The guests gathered around her in sympathy, offering comfort, leaving Aldrich to die on the floor beneath her tears. And as his vision blurred, as the life drained from his body, Celeste leaned close to his ear and whispered the truth, the cruelest truth of all. Marcus Devo was my cousin. Jeremiah Samuel Rochelle was my uncle by marriage. I've been working with Philip and Henri since 1845, waiting for the perfect moment to make you die the same way they did, slowly, painfully, and utterly alone. The truth hit Aldrich harder than the poison now coursing through his veins. Celeste wasn't just a pawn. She was part of the family, an active conspirator in a plan that had been years in the making. Every meal she had cooked, every word of comfort she had spoken, every illusion of domestic peace, all of it had been a cruel performance, carefully staged to maximize his suffering while hiding the real cause of his decline. As Aldrich's vision darkened and his breath came in short, ragged gasps, he could still hear Celeste's sobs echoing through the room. She was pleading with Dr. Warren to try harder, praying aloud for her husband's life, her voice cracking with heartbreak. Around them, guests wept and offered comfort, completely convinced they were witnessing a tragic accident, not the final act of an 11-year revenge. Jeremiah Aldrich died at exactly 9:47 p.m. on June 18, 1854, surrounded by neighbors who believe he had suffered a heart attack or stroke, worn down by months of stress and failing health. Dr. Warren's official report listed the cause of death as natural causes associated with prolonged nervous exhaustion. It satisfied everyone except Philippe Devo and Henri Rochelle, who knew precisely what killed him and why. The funeral was crowded, with Celeste playing the role of a grieving widow, so convincingly that several of the local ladies offered to help her manage Willowbrook Plantation during her mourning. No one suspected that the tear-streaked woman at the graveside was, in fact, quietly celebrating the successful end of Louisiana's most elaborate murder plot. But Aldrich's death was not the end. Philippe and Henri had planned for everything, even what would happen after. As Aldrich's legal heir, Celeste inherited Willowbrook Plantation, along with all its debts and obligations. Debts that, as Philippe and Henri soon reminded her, were owed to them. Within a month of the funeral, Celeste signed documents transferring ownership of the plantation to the two men in exchange for forgiveness of the outstanding debts. Shortly after, she vanished from Louisiana entirely, likely heading north, armed with enough money to begin a new life as a free woman, somewhere no one knew her past or the blood she carried on her hands. Official records raised no suspicions. Authorities had larger concerns as the country edged closer to civil war. The story of the plantation owner who had married his former slave and died of natural causes became nothing more than a curious local legend, a footnote in Louisiana's history, a tale of eccentric behavior driven by financial ruin. But within certain New Orleans families, another version of the story was whispered through generations. The real version. It spoke of conspiracy so patient, so meticulous, that it took 11 years to complete. It told of a justice so perfectly measured that punishment mirrored crime, in both length and suffering. Philippe Devo and Henri Rochelle had achieved something extraordinary for their time. They carried out a murder investigation no court would have dared touch, and delivered a death sentence no judge would have imposed. And they did it all without leaving a trace. Their success required intelligence, wealth, patience, and an intimate understanding of how Louisiana's social order and laws truly worked. What they did next proved just how complete their revenge really was. Instead of selling Willowbrook Plantation for profit, Philippe and Henri transformed it. They turned the state into a refuge for freed slaves and escaped bondspersons, a sanctuary that secretly became a stop on the Underground Railroad. The Grand Plantation house that had once hosted Louisiana's elite now sheltered the very people Aldrich had spent his life exploiting. The transformation was both poetic and invisible. Philippe and Henry's business connections provided cover for the unusual activity, while their public image as respectable businessmen deflected suspicion. They used their enemy's wealth, his land, his legacy, to wage war against everything he had ever stood for. Perhaps the most remarkable outcome of their revenge was how completely Jeremiah Aldrich vanished from history. Unlike most murder victims, he received no recognition, not even as a cautionary tale. His wealth was redistributed among the families he had wronged. His property was reborn as a symbol of freedom. His reputation was ruined not by exposure, but by his own disgraceful actions. And so his story ended not with infamy, but with erasure. No monuments, no descendants, no legacy. It was as though he had never lived at all. This story reminds us that sometimes true justice operates far beyond the reach of the law, especially in societies built to protect the powerful and silence the powerless. What do you think of this story? Do you believe every truth was revealed? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this tale gave you chills, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more dark mysteries from the forgotten corners of history. If you enjoyed this chilling tale and crave more stories filled with horror, mystery, and dark secrets, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. And share this story with someone who loves uncovering eerie mysteries as much as you do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.